Welcome, all you adventurous readers, to the epic worlds of Alfred Döblin, where we explore the life and works of this fascinating but little-known early 20th century writer. Brought to you by the website beyondalexanderplatz.com.
Welcome to episode 4, where we discuss the first of Döblin's 9 epic novels, The Three Leaps of Wang. I'm Chris Godwin.
And I'm Katie Kavanagh.
So the aim is not to give a summary of the novel, but to put it in the context of Döblin's life in 1911-1912, as well as his own developing theory of the modern epic. We're putting together a volume in the Adventurous Readers series devoted to Wang Lun. This will be a kind of a student's guide, but the aim is to enhance the reader's pleasure, not to help you pass exams.
Oh, thank goodness for that, Chris. I've had enough of exams for the moment. So I think the best thing for us to find out about is what was happening in Alfred Döblin's life at the time he wrote Wang Lun.
Oh, an awful lot was happening. You could say there was about 4 strands of critical developments were all coalescing around this time. And the first strand, you could say, was to do with his engagement and then a year later his marriage to a partner who was basically sort of, preferred by the families rather than being a love match.
Right.
And then the second one, the hospital he was working in didn't want their staff to be married, so the staff had to leave when they got married.
Gosh, was that usual practice at that time?
It was fairly widespread in Europe, I think. I mean, for instance, female teachers for quite a long time were not allowed to teach once they'd got married.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible! Goodness,
Yeah.
you'd be
And then the
staff retention.
I mean, what this meant was he no longer had his kind of safe job where the work sort of came to him. He had to go and start his own medical practice, which he found, pretty unsettling at the time. Then the third one was his involvement with the kind of cultural ferment that was going on in Berlin at the time around modernism and expressionism. There was a big art exhibition of expressionist art where he had been very enthusiastic. In fact, the dedication to the Wang Lun book is very clearly based on a picture by the Italian artist Boccioni called "The Street Enters the House."
Right.
Right, lots of noise and things, flooding into what used to be sort of private spaces and so on. And then the final one, he'd spent a decade sort of not really hiding away in hospitals, but he had seen going into the medical world as a kind of retreat from the struggles of daily life. But he'd been developing, an idea of what made human beings tick. He did say at one point that the only people he could stand were lunatics and children. But he'd spent a long kind of sort of ripening period where his writing was basically short stories. By this time he'd written a dozen short stories, which were actually published in 1912. And he'd written lots of papers for medical journals as well. But this was all sort of small scale stuff that he'd been building up, within him some kind of pressure to do something really ambitious. And, he thought he really wanted to start now on a big novel.
Right.
So these were the kind of 4 pressures which were all building up around the same time.
So in February 1911, he marries. Oh no, he doesn't marry.
He gets engaged. Yeah.
He gets engaged to Erna, his wife, to be. Is there any? You said it wasn't a love match.
It was more that both the families wanted a kind of a good, a good, dependable partner for their, their husband or their wife, and but one.
And was that the standard of the time? Was that the traditional thing, where arranged marriages are a thing?
Oh,
or?
I think in the kind of the upwardly mobile classes.
I'm assuming it wasn't.
Yeah.
But
well, no, I think in the
my-
upwardly mobile classes, it was very much. You had to make a good match.
Right.
I mean, love was a secondary issue. But here, I mean, in Döblin's case, there was also the fact that, I mean, his heritage was Jewish. He came from Jewish families, and
Yes.
his family wanted a nice Jewish girl to be his wife.
Got you.
For the previous 5 years, he'd been with a non-Jewish young lady, and so that,
And that was
meant
one
her
of the nurses at the hospital.
yes. So that was a bit of a wrench as well. He wasn't. She wasn't the right type for him. According to the families.
Oh, that's sad. And obviously, they had been together, him and Frida, his previous liaison, for 5 years. So, had anything come out of that relationship? Was there a child?
This also is a rather interesting coincidence, which must have built up the pressure on Döblin, because at almost the same time that he got engaged to Erna, Frida conceived a child, which was born in October of 1911.
With the father being Döblin.
Döblin acknowledged himself as the father, which was very responsible of him. But then, I mean, a few years later, Frida unfortunately died. I mean, during the First World War, she died of TB, probably caused by bad nutrition and so on during the blockade. And so the son Bodo was brought up by his grandmother in Hamburg. But Döblin kept in touch with him all through his life.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
great. And then, so in 1912, he starts the preliminary work for Wang Lun.
Yes. So he had this pressure inside him that he needed to start something ambitious. His eye was caught by some, there was lots going on in the world outside Germany at this time. I mean, the Chinese Empire had just ended after 2,000 years. His eye was caught by some pieces in the newspapers about an uprising by gold panners in Siberia. These are mostly Koreans and Chinese in Siberia.
Interesting.
And, the conditions there were such that they sort of wanted to set up their own kind of workers' republic, which was pretty strongly stamped upon by the Tsarist authorities, with tales of awful bloodshed and so on. Cossack soldiers mowing down these rebellious workers.
Right.
So that he wrote about this in a big linen-bound notebook, which is still in the archive. But then he'd also come across a reference to an 18th century Chinese sectarian uprising involving a chap called Wang Lun. Right. And so gradually his focus went from Siberia to 18th century China. But the underlying motif was much the same. It's human beings trying to live in a world where force and authority are continually bearing down on them.
What's the setting in Wang Lun? Where in China is it? Are we talking a mountainous region, or are we talking in lowlands?
Well, it's basically the north of China, which is a mixture of quite very rugged mountain ranges and very flat and flooded plains.
So big, picturesque scapes.
Oh, there's lots of landscape, yes. And he, just working from looking at maps and gazetteers and travelogues and so on, he managed to imagine a very realistic picture of the landscape of China. I mean, I lived several years in China, so I'm able to sort of judge how well he had caught it, because sometimes when writers are writing about a foreign country, they make awful mistakes about it's obvious he's never been there because there's no such thing as this kind of river there, or this kind of thing.
That's a really interesting segue, actually, Chris. We should say, so why did you think, I'm going to translate Wang Lun?
Right, because, 30 odd years ago, I knew almost nothing about Döblin, just as you do now. But I came across on an Austrian railway stall, I came across two paperbacks by the author Alfred Döblin,
Yeah.
and they both looked sort of Chinesey kind of titles. I thought, this is interesting. I didn't realise
Who is this character?
Who is this
Yeah.
character? I didn't know he had anything to do with China.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I bought those 2 paperbacks and, started reading through them.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as I read, I realised, hang on, has anybody translated this into English before?
Mm-hmm.
And as far as I could tell, no.
Oh, okay, interesting. So you found the 2 copies. What was the other book?
Oh,
then?
the other book. Well, this was very interesting because the other book was a selection of short stories, but the title story, as I read it, I realised, this is actually part of the Wang novel. Well, why on earth is it in this separate book? And I did a little bit of digging around. Because I got a degree at Hong Kong University, I had access to their library, which had a fairly small but interesting collection of books by and about Döblin. And I realised that a lot had been cut out of Döblin's manuscript before it was published.
So
And this story in the second book was the introduction
got you.
to the novel.
And so if it was cut out, obviously that was purposeful. So as an editorial decision to remove it.
Right, but
What's
that
your
decision,
thoughts?
yes. What Döblin had done, he had written to a chap called Martin Buber, who was starting to become famous as a philosopher. He had already written a very interesting afterword to a translated book on Chinese philosophy, which had come out a couple of years before.
Right.
And he was also working as a publisher's reader, so he was obviously a kind of useful contact. So Döblin very respectfully wrote to him and asked for advice, particularly asking him to recommend any sources on 18th century China that Döblin himself hadn't been able to come across. But then when he'd finished the manuscript, Martin Buber agreed to look over the manuscript and give some suggestions. And his suggestions really were, this needs to be cut down a great deal,
Okay.
right? In focus on the underlying theme and cut out everything which gives a kind of political specific time. Because several of the cut episodes involved the suppression of a rebellion in what is now Xinjiang in the northwest of China, involving some nomads who sort of come and go into the certain area. But
Right.
when these nomads had wanted to settle in the Zungar Basin, they'd caused a bit of trouble, and the emperor sent his army out to massacre them all.
Gosh.
So this was all these episodes to do with that were cut, but this introductory episode was very central to that particular aspect of the manuscript.
Right.
Right. So anyway, it had to go along with that whole storyline.
Okay.
And then this meant that then the theme of this kind of the power of the world against the powerless individual, let us say, was then became more timeless.
And so have you put it back in?
Yes, my translation was the first time that the introduction had been reunited with the main text.
I see.
And it really does make a difference, because the end of the novel, which we'll be doing a reading from at the end of this episode, the end of the novel circles back to the incident in that cut introductory
so
chapter.
It makes more sense.
Yes, it becomes a rounded
Sandwiched
whole.
together.
Yes.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. We got not off track, but it's interesting to, obviously there are editorial decisions made all along the way, and you as a translator are also making some editorial decisions depending on what manuscripts you have in front of you. So that's interesting.
But Döblin has suffered from some editorial decisions sort of all the way along. I mean, in one of his trilogies, which were being edited in the 1960s to come out in a selected works series,
Yes.
The editor there decided that the third volume of the trilogy was simply not worth including.
Right.
So that was a fairly major editorial decision,
Yeah.
and drew heavy criticism from the Döblin industry.
That's very interesting. So we'll go back to how he gathered his materials.
Yeah.
And so he sought out different sources. So
I'm
I'm assuming that he never travelled to China.
He'd never been to China, and this was something which astonished a lot of the reviewers.
Okay.
He had this creative spark to do with this theme of individuals against the world. He was nurturing it with everything he could. He was kind of feeding it with all things from maps, from travelogues, from
Were there pieces in museums?
the Anthropology Museum in Berlin had quite an extensive Chinese collection, so
Okay.
he could look at the officials' costumes, the kind of badges that denoted the rank of the official, which were quite sort of picturesque. Is it a pheasant or is it a peacock? And there's a big difference in the ranks or something. This
Right.
kind of thing.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, and he was making notes of all kinds of Chinese names, of places, of people, of.
Did he ever sketch anything down?
He sketched maps. Things, yes,
Interesting.
yeah, but he all this was nourishment, nurturing this spark and filling it out with colour, with incidents, with sort of names and places, and so on, until it reached a stage where the facts were starting to sort of press for being put into words, but words which reveal to the reader what the reality is. He's very convinced that you shouldn't, you really need the words on the page and the sentences that they form to have been very deliberately constructed to bring an immediate reality to the reader's eye, so that the reader then is building the picture. The author is not pushing the picture onto the reader, it's emerging into the reader's mind.
And so, as his first epic, he's gathered all the materials that he needs, and that I imagine that will continue through the writing process in some form or other. But the first, big flush of gathering evidence and materials together is the main part of that.
He did write it down in a fairly short time. I mean, they reckon it's about 10 months
Okay.
from starting the writing to
Wow.
the end. And there's it was in his handwriting, it was a kind of 1,000-page manuscript,
Gosh,
which
so
turned into
that's-
500 printed pages.
That is a lot of time to devote to writing when you're also working as a medical professional.
He would write. He says he could write on the steps outside the hospital emergency room. He could write on trams. He could write anywhere he happened to
Wow.
be. He'd be scribbling down some
That's
of these things that
fantastic. That's really
churning away
interesting.
inside him.
That's fascinating because so often you hear about different writers' processes and how they set aside time early morning, or some people write late into the night or whatever.
Or you must have exactly this table in the cafe, or
Yeah, that's
something.
it. Exactly.
Yes, yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you. So 10 months, quite a rapid process then.
Well, it was all coming flooding out, because the germ of the idea, the fleshing out of the idea, the way that, as he put it, these ideas begin to cloak themselves in words, right? So he's already basically got a lot of the words and the sentences inside him, and these were now just emerging onto the page.
Okay, so did he already have a publisher at that stage?
Well, there's a publisher had agreed to take a small volume of 12 of his short stories, and these were in fact published in 1912, and had indicated that he might be interested in the novel, But when Döblin presented the manuscript, this publisher sort of rejected it. And the manuscript then went around, I think, 3 or 4 other publishing houses over the next few years, until eventually Sammy Fisher of the S. Fisher publisher signed a contract with him, and that relationship really lasted until 1933.
Interesting.
So that was that was a good find.
Definitely. All right, Chris. So the novel has been published. He found a publisher. What was the response to it?
Yeah, I mean, remember, it was published in 1916, so something like 4 years had gone by between finishing writing the manuscript and actually seeing it in print.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Had you already started writing something else in between seeing it in print?
An entire novel, yes.
Wow, okay. Are we going
But
to
not
talk
an
about
not
that?
an epic novel.
Oh, not an epic.
Yes.
So it won't be there. Okay, fine.
Yeah, no, the reviewers were astonished and, for the most part, very enthusiastic, and they sort of reacted with wonder at the way that kind of China appeared in such a real environment and a real culture, which no other European writer had ever achieved in a foreign locale. There was only one reviewer who was very sniffy about the fact that the novel had won a prize and thought that this demeaned the prize.
What prize did it
It was called the
win?
Fontana Prize, named
Okay.
after Theodore Fontana, who was the kind of the doyen of the kind of the 19th century middle class social novel.
And in terms, so the critics enjoyed it,
Yes.
but what about the everyday person on the street? Was it being bought by...
Well, it went
Did it
through.
sell well?
It went through 12 printings, I think, up to 1923.
Oh gosh, okay.
So that
it was
that
quite
was
popular.
I think before Berlin Alexanderplatz, this was the one of his books that did sell.
Great.
The only people who didn't effusively welcome it were his old friends from the expressionist circle around the journal Der Sturm. They
Interesting.
completely ignored it.
And why was that?
Well, although Döblin retained friendly relations with them,
Yeah.
his idea about what word art should be aiming at was sort of diametrically opposed to what some of the expressionists were
Yes.
aiming at, because Döblin's word art was aimed at digging down into a very deep reality beneath the surface of the world, between the surface of life.
Of course.
But the expressionists were sort of, let's put lots of words together in lots of exciting ways and so on.
I remember, we've definitely talked about this in a previous
Yeah.
episode briefly.
Yeah.
Yes. Okie dokie. Well, does that wrap us up a little bit? Are we ready for our reading?
We could be, and possibly the reading will give rise to 1 or 2 more questions.
Okay. Yeah, great.
Right.
Let's go for it.
Right. So I've selected the last 4 pages of the novel,
Okay.
which is quite interesting because the first passage depicts the government in very jubilant mood at having crushed all these nasty rebels and dealing with them in a fairly merciless way. And the Emperor Qianlong is really quite gleeful about all the action taken to
Okay.
against the rebels.
Macabre.
But then the passage then that you'll read is the wife of one of the generals who's been involved in crushing the rebels, and she has lost her son and a daughter in the turmoil.
Oh.
She is travelling south to seek comfort from the goddess Guan Yin.
Okay.
Right. So we have the Emperor Qianlong, and Hai Tang is the wife of the general.
Okay.
Right. So
Let's go.
let's go. Government measures winding up this affair lasted a month. During this time, prisoners were transported to Peking. Qianlong interrogated the greater part of them personally to ascertain connivance by officials and dilatoriness in persecution. Then the brothers and sisters were sentenced before a large crowd outside Peking, in accordance with the law against heresy. Their families and the families of known rebels were banished to the Ili and to Mongolia, some 2,000 people in all. Wang Lun's home village was burned to the ground. The remains of his parents were exhumed, dismembered. All residents of the village were driven out, and their scanty chattels were confiscated. The corpses of the rebels rotted in the streets of Linqing, poisoned the air until the few remaining inhabitants turned to the prefect. Then a decree of the emperor ordered the carcasses to be gathered and piled outside the wall near the Grand Canal. 2 wide, shallow graves were dug for the men and women on the riverbank, at a spot where evil spirits congregated. Into these were tipped barrow loads of cavaders. Debris from the burned-out houses and charred beams were piled on top. From the canal, these 2 long grave mounds and rubble heaps looked like the backs of 2 giant moles scrabbling out of the earth. Qianlong basked. Officers, generals, high officials, advisers who had taken part in the suppression of the rebellion received titles of honour, estates. On the day of the Thanksgiving festival, the emperor inscribed in a firm hand in the inner hall of the Confucius temple, "Had Confucius been here, he would not have proceeded more thoroughly than I."
While the corpses still rotted in the quiet streets and in the houses of Linqing, Hai Tang, the governor's wife, travelled on a great ship of mourning, surrounded by her women, along the coast to her southern homeland. She wanted to travel alone. She told Xiao Hui, when he sold his house in Shanhaiquan, that he should take a concubine, have a son by her. Soft autumn came. The ship glided along the southern coast. From the towns, music shrilled. Harvest processions thudded in the fields. Junks streaked playfully over the dark water. Hai Tang, still as death, on the broad, heavy ship. She did not journey directly to her home. The ship anchored off the island of Putashan. Hai Tang wanted to go before the merciful goddess, Kuan Yin, secure for herself the prayers of the most pious monks. Sunny jags of granite peaks, dreaming tucked-in landscapes, slender fan palms with clear voices, camellias, 100,000, transpiring ponds, floating lilies, between hedges, behind stony paths, a temple at the foot of the cliff, stretched out sky. Supported by 2 women, Hai Tang rustled along the path in grey, voluminous clothes, grey veil over her face. They went through the entrance hall, across the vast terrace and the platform in front of the prayer hall. Hai Tang's eyes tolerated the reliefs on the steep breastwork of the terrace, extolling childish love. In front of the altar, the eternal flame smoked in its carved wooden niche. Curtains, patchwork carpets, standards, drums, incense. Goddess Guan Yin, huge at the back. She sat there by the wall in a white robe, left hand delicately raised. Her face was golden. She wore a crown of 5 lotus leaves. Her blue hair was fastened with a diadem. She sat on the marble plinth, slender of hip, strong-legged, head leaning slightly back, violet bib. White silk flowed over her narrow shoulders. The eyelids beneath black brows were lowered, but the yellowish lashes, thin, slightly parted lips, seemed to flutter gently. In such mildness she kept her silence. In such absorption she heard and gave. Tablets and banners praised her. Guan Yin, great friend, her merciful boat conveys all across. Her grace is vast as the waves of the sea. She arose for everyone, a mother's heart. Her golden body will not perish. Monks in brown robes pressed foreheads to the ground before her. Murmurs, tinkling a soft chant. Haitang crumpled her veil, breathed gustily and smiled, gazed away over the monks. It was late evening. The island was vanishing in the darkness. Bearing lanterns, 100 monks left their cells and chapels in procession along stony paths. Haitang had donated a vast sum in order that they should pray for her to the goddess. She sat at the bend in the path under a boulder of granite. The procession murmured past, arms crossed, cowl after cowl. She paid the monks, an endless stream. Proud, triumphant, she surveyed the boundless throng. She must succeed in overpowering the goddess. Peace. Peace was what she wanted. Wang Lun had taken both children from her. Vengeance had failed, and even had it succeeded, would have been of no use. Peace for herself, peace for her dead children, endless, ever-renewed floggings for Wang Lun. It grew calm in her as the torches vanished amid chanting into the temple. She gulped the warm air. The goddess had better look out now the monks were crowding in on her, struggling with her. For Haitang, her maids got to their feet. Haitang returned to the ship for the night. The next evening, she sat once more under the boulder of granite. The torches swayed past. In the darkness, she turned her triumphant face, contorted with hate, towards the dark temple. She shook her arms over the heads of the monks. On the third evening, she sent her maids away. The murmur of the procession filled the paths. Haitang stared into the dazzling torchlight. She fell down, screamed, tore her breast. The goddess was stronger. The monks could not prevail. They could pray and pray and pray. Who had the strength? Who could save her? Then it seemed to her the monks were back already. There was a rustling, a gleam played over the ground. In the light of the newly risen moon, slender-hipped Guan Yin walked past her, mother of pearl white. The diadem on her curly hair flashed grass green when she turned her inclined head. She smiled, looked at Haitang, said, "Haitang, leave your breast alone. Your children sleep beside me. Be calm. Do not resist. Oh, do not resist." Haitang looked again into the green trailing moonlight. She sat up, pressed shovelled hands over her cold face. Be calm. Not resist. Have I the strength?
So, yeah, thanks for that reading, Katie. I think there's a few things to say about both of them, and that's the very cinematic style of the words that he is using to bring very, very vivid scenes before our eyes with very economical means.
Oh, absolutely. Especially when he talks about cadavers, corpses. I mean, it's quite powerful.
Yeah,
it's quite macabre. Well,
this is interesting. This, of course, is before the First World War.
Yeah, I feel like it's very dark. Like
yeah.
It's if you didn't know better, you would say he was suffering from something like post-traumatic stress. Like he's got such the picture that he paints is very, and yet he hasn't been through the First World War yet.
Not yet. And yet,
Yeah.
I mean, there are many scenes in Wang Lun which are extremely violent and very visceral. And he's been criticised by this by, some quite eminent critics, including W.G. Seybold, who wrote a whole PhD dissertation on, partly on Döblin's kind of predisposition to intensely violent scenes.
Mm-hmm. Why was he critical?
Well, because he thought this was some kind of psychological aberration which didn't really serve much the purpose of literature.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, but in fact, I mean, a lot of the passages, they are very powerful,
Yeah.
and they draw you into the situation that the participants find themselves in.
Yeah.
And then the
surely
First World War comes along and intensifies this tenfold.
Yeah. Surely, if you're painting a rich picture, that is the purpose of the text, isn't it?
Yes,
To paint a
yes.
rich picture. There's
Yeah.
nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. But I mean, this cinematic style was something that even in 1911, when the cinema was barely, I don't know what, 20 years old, he was saying, literature should be adopting the techniques of the cinema to get through to reality.
Right. Sorry, I was just flicking because obviously we have the book in front of us, The Three Leaps of Wang Lun, and I wanted to see where it set the scene in that first part that we read. And you're right, it's like there's such a change of scene as well from the part that you read, Chris, and then suddenly the part I was reading where it said soft autumn came.
Yes.
And it's like that now suddenly you've jumped to it, and he hasn't jumped with a chapter break. He's jumped with
it's just a paragraph.
It's just a paragraph.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, there's no.
Yeah.
So it's quite a shift.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I mean, it's quite not a tongue twister, but it's there are parts of it, obviously the names and that kind of thing, the Chinese names that I'm not familiar with.
Exactly, they're quite alien to any of the
very
readers
much
in 1920s Germany. Yes. Yeah.
I mean, we had a little conversation before doing the reading separately off air where you were trying to teach me how to say some of the names. And that was quite interesting, especially turning the K into a G.
Yeah,
and,
well, I mean, I have to say that I did clean up the romanizations quite considerably. Because, I mean, Döblin was drawing on all kinds of disparate texts which used different systems of romanizing Chinese characters. It was a nightmare trying to work out what they were referring to. But, there's a very much cleaned up text in terms of romanization.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Chris, how long have you been studying Chinese for?
I began to study Chinese in 1966.
Amazing.
Absolutely amazing.
I mean, you'd be thoroughly employable now.
Well, well, here I still am.
Yeah.
Anyway, would you like to know, I mean, looking back on his first magnificent epic,
yes.
what were Döblin's feelings, let's say, 40 years later? Would you like to know?
Yes, very much so.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
So
how did he feel about it?
This is what he says in an essay he wrote in 1948. Right? I saw how the world, defined as nature and society, rolls over people like a mighty iron tank. Wang Lun experienced this. Oh, you notice mighty iron tank. That's First World War imagery, right? Wang Lun experienced this. Along with other wounded souls, he retreats from this violent, anti-human world, and even without attacking it, he presents a challenge. Still, it rolls over him and his friends. In this case, the world proves stronger. Nothing else is proven. Right, so he wrote that in the year that he turned 70, considering he was in his 30s when he wrote Wang Lun. That's quite a long timeline to be looking back on your achievements.
Yeah, absolutely. And for a gap of 40 years, so he's been quite reflective.
Yeah, well, this is it. He was fairly unique, I think, among all the great writers in developing a theory of what literary creation is and actually embodying it in very substantial works.
And Chris, how old was he when he died?
Well, he died in 1957, just before reaching 80.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Chris, I did notice as we were reading through, actually, there were a few misprints. So I read the word who, and it said like WHOO and things like that.
Oh, Lord. Don't please talk to me about misprints. I had no responsibility whatsoever for these.
Okay, so that's just like the computerized system that
the paperback, I believe, was produced from an optical character readout from the original edition of 1991.
Okay.
And the problem was the optical character readout misinterpreted occasional letters or clusters of letters. And there's one particular horrible example I noticed there where the letter lowercase d was interpreted as lowercase c and l.
Okay. Okay.
And so as a sentence which involves black dung becomes black clung. But I was given I was given no opportunity whatever to correct the proofs before the paperback came out.
That's a shame.
Yeah.
Well, you never know. There might be another edition.
Oh, I'm sure there will be decades as we go along.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant. All right. Well, I think that concludes this episode today. What do you think, Chris?
Well, this was the first of our episodes actually dealing with one of the epic novels.
Yes.
So there will be others.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, including, you notice that the last sentence of the quotation that you read, Katie, had a question mark.
It did.
And
yes.
this is interesting.
Not resist. Have I the strength?
Have I the strength? And this actually segues into a major theme in his next major epic novel, Wallenstein of the 30 Years' War. How exactly that happens, we will have to explore in a later episode.
Very interesting. Thank you so much, Chris. I think that's goodbye from me.
Well, thank you, Katie, and it's goodbye from me.
Excellent. Bye-bye, everyone.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Epic Worlds of Alfred Döblin. Join us next time to explore more about this fascinating writer's life and works. Meanwhile, visit the website beyond-alexanderplatz.com for posts about Döblin and some of his unjustly neglected contemporaries, as well as downloads of translations. So until next time, happy reading!